The dog found him before the people did. Daniel Hicks was 19 years old, 3 weeks into building a cabin that everyone insisted would be the death of him, when a half-starved shepherd mix emerged from the tree lane and quietly sat beside his growing pile of river stones. The dog didn't beg or whine. It simply watched Daniel work with eyes that had already seen too much and expected very little. "Lost?" Daniel asked. The dog's tail moved once, not a wag exactly, more an acknowledgement that the question had been understood. Daniel went back to work. An hour later, when he stopped to eat a cold sandwich, he split it in half without thinking and placed one portion on the ground. The dog ate slowly, carefully, like an animal that had learned food could disappear at any moment. "Guess you're staying," Daniel said, and the tail moved again, twice this time. He named her Scout, and for the next 4 months she never left his side. Montana, September 1962. The town of Clearwater had exactly one opinion about Daniel Hartley, and it wasn't a favorable one. He had arrived in June alone, driving a truck that looked older than he was, towing a trailer loaded with tools and supplies, and he paid cash for 40 acres of mountain land nobody wanted, too far from the road, too close to the peaks, too exposed to brutal winters that regularly cut the area off from civilization for weeks at a time. Summer cabin. Earl Dawson asked, the real estate agent handling the sale, more curious than concerned. "Year-round home," Daniel replied. Earl laughed, then realized the boy was serious, then laughed harder, because what else do you do when a teenager announces plans to live alone in the mountains through a Montana winter? "Son," Earl said, "I've lived here 43 years. I've seen grown men, experienced men with proper houses, backup generators, wives who know how to ration supplies, barely survive December up here. You're 17. You're from..." Earl checked his notes. "Chicago. You'll freeze to death before Christmas, assuming you don't starve first." Daniel signed the papers without responding. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns where entertainment is scarce and other people's foolishness becomes theater. By the end of his first week in Clearwater, Daniel was a local attraction, the crazy kid from Chicago who thought he could homestead in the wilderness like it was still 1862. The men at Murdoch's Hardware watched him load supplies into his truck and placed bets on how long he'd last. 2 weeks, said Frank Murdoch, ringing up bags of cement, rolls of wire mesh, enough nails to build a battleship. October at the latest. First hard frost and he'll be running back to the city. "I'll give him until the first snow," countered Ray Bishop from the gas station. "City boys don't know real cold." "Bold of you to assume he'll last that long," said Harold Whitfield, 67, ranching these mountains since before the war. "That land he bought, the old Garrett claim, there's a reason nobody's lived there in 30 years. Wind comes down that valley like a freight train. Snow piles up 15, 20 feet. Last family that tried wintering there lost 2 children to the cold." The men nodded, not cruel, just realistic. The Montana mountains had killed better prepared people than a scrawny kid from Illinois. Daniel heard them. He'd developed excellent hearing over the years, a survival skill learned in a different wilderness, the foster care system that moved him through 11 homes before he aged out, leaving him an inheritance from a grandmother he'd never met, just enough money to buy 40 acres of impossible land. He didn't argue. Arguing was pointless. He'd learned that too. He loaded his truck and drove back up the mountain. The first stones came from the river. Daniel had studied masonry from library books, practicing on small projects, a fire pit, a low garden wall, before attempting anything structural. Every book said the same thing: river stones were difficult. Their rounded surfaces refused to stack cleanly, demanding more mortar, more patience, more skill, but they were free, and Daniel had more time than money. Each morning he waded into the icy water, Scout watching from the bank, choosing stones by size, shape, and an instinct he couldn't explain but was learning to trust. The cold numbed his feet within minutes. By late September, ice formed along the edges, and every step felt like walking into knives. His hands cracked and bled, the water reopening wounds before they could heal, leaving his fingers permanently mapped with splits and calluses. At night he wrapped his hands in cloth, coated them with petroleum jelly, then unwrapped them again each morning to start over. The sled helped. He'd built it from scrap lumber, a simple flat platform on runners that Scout quickly learned to pull. The dog threw herself into the harness with pure enthusiasm, as if hauling rocks was the job she'd been waiting for her entire life. "Good girl," Daniel would say, and now her tail wagged properly. Not the cautious twitch of those first days, but wide sweeping arcs that kicked snow in every direction. By October 1st, he had gathered enough stone to begin building. The boys came up the mountain when they heard he was actually constructing something. Harold Whitfield drove the road first, curiosity dressed up as concern, fooling no one. He stood at the edge of Daniel's clearing, watching the teenager place stones into what was clearly becoming a wall. "Looks like a foundation," Ray Bishop said, having come along to keep Harold company. An even thinner excuse. "Stone foundation," Frank Murdoch added. He'd closed the hardware store early, claimed inventory, and driven up with them. "That's actually not stupid. Wood rots. Stone doesn't." They watched in silence. Daniel didn't acknowledge them, though he clearly knew they were there. He kept working, choosing stones from neatly sorted piles, spreading mortar with a steady, practiced motion, setting each rock, and adjusting it until it locked perfectly into place. A fire burned nearby to keep a bucket of mortar from freezing. A dog they didn't recognize lay beside the flames, watching them with sharp, attentive eyes. "Where'd he get the dog?" Ray asked. "More importantly," Harold said slowly, "where'd he learn to do that?" The stonework was good. Better than good. It was professional quality. Each rock fit its neighbors like pieces of a puzzle, with mortar lines clean and even. Harold had built stone walls himself 40 years earlier and knew exactly how difficult river rock was to work with. This boy was making it look effortless. "Library," Daniel said without turning around, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You can learn almost anything from books if you're willing to practice." The men exchanged looks. "Mind if we take a closer look?" Harold asked. Daniel shrugged. "Free country." They moved in slowly, studying the work. The foundation formed a rectangle roughly 12 by 16 feet. Small, but enough for one man. The walls were already 2 feet high in places, with stones carefully chosen so each course locked into the ones below and above. "You building the whole house out of stone?" Frank asked. "Stone walls, wood roof, stone chimney." Daniel gestured to a second, smaller foundation taking shape nearby. "The fireplace goes on that end. Heavy stones at the bottom, lighter as it rises." "That's going to weigh tons," Harold said, crouching to inspect the mortar. "How are you lifting it all?" "One stone at a time." "This is a 6-month job for a full crew," Frank added. "You're doing it alone." "Scout helps with hauling." Daniel nodded toward the dog, who thumped her tail at her name. "The rest is time and patience. I've got plenty of both." They stayed nearly an hour, watching him work, asking questions. Daniel answered briefly, never rudely. When they finally left, Harold paused beside his truck and turned back. "I was wrong about you, son. You're not going to freeze to death before Christmas." He hesitated. "You might freeze to death in January, but it won't be for lack of trying." Daniel understood. It was the closest thing to a compliment Harold Whitfield knew how to give. October passed in a blur of stone, mortar, and aching muscles. The walls rose inch by inch, foot by foot. Daniel found a rhythm: wake before dawn, fire up the mortar, haul stones while it warmed, lay courses until dark, then collapse into his tent and sleeping bag. Repeat. Scout adapted easily, sleeping when he slept, working when he worked, and somehow knowing which stones he wanted and which he didn't. The townspeople came more often now, not to help. Daniel hadn't asked, and Montana pride wouldn't allow them to offer, but to watch, to witness, to quietly revise their predictions about when the crazy city kid would finally quit. "November," Frank Murdoch amended at the hardware store. "He'll sail through October, but November's when it gets real." "December," Ray Bishop countered. "The walls are going up fast. If he gets a roof on before the real snow hits, he might have a chance." "The roof won't matter if he can't heat the place," Harold said. "You've seen how big that chimney foundation is. He's planning something serious. The question is whether he can finish it in time." They were all wrong as it turned out. but not in the way they expected. On November 7th, the stone walls were finished. Daniel stepped back and stared at what he'd made. For walls of river rock, 6 feet high, thick and solid, strong enough to stop a truck, beautiful in the quiet way only handmade things ever are. Every stone had passed through his hands. Every joint had been smoothed by his fingers. Every inch belonged to him. Scout sat beside him, tongue out despite the cold, looking up at him with something that felt a lot like pride. "We did it, girl," he said softly. Her tail swept the snow. The roof came next, and it came fast. Daniel had been preparing timber during the weeks of wall building, cutting and notching logs whenever the mortar needed time to set. Now he assembled them like a puzzle. Posts first, then beams, then rafters, each piece sliding into place exactly as planned. The first beam was the worst. He had to lift it alone, raise it over his head while standing on the stone wall, and guide it into position without dropping it on himself. His arms trembled. His back screamed. Scout barked encouragement from below, running in frantic circles, unable to help but unwilling to stay quiet. The beam settled into its notches. Daniel drove wooden pegs through the joints, locking it in place forever. 1 down, he breathed. 11 to go. By November 15th, the roof frame stood complete. By November 20th, shingles were going on. By November 25th, Thanksgiving Day, though Daniel had no one to celebrate with, the cabin was sealed. That night, he lit a fire in the stone fireplace, the first fire in a home he'd built with his own hands. Scout curled at his feet as warmth radiated from the stones that absorbed the heat and gave it back slowly. Outside, the temperature fell to 15 below zero. Inside, it stayed above 50. Daniel didn't cry. He'd learned not to years earlier, in foster homes where tears were treated as weakness. But something loosened in his chest that night, some tight knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. He was going to survive the winter. He knew it. The cabin was solid. The chimney drew clean. The supplies would last until spring. He fell asleep by the fire in his home with his dog. And for the first time in 17 years, he felt safe. The blizzard arrived on December 19th. It began quietly. Steady snow through the morning, wind rising by noon, and visibility fading through the afternoon. Daniel had seen storms before and had ridden out several in the 3 weeks since finishing the cabin. He followed his routine, hauled in extra firewood, checked food stores, and melted snow for water while the fire burned hot. But this storm was different. By nightfall, the wind became something more than wind, a physical force that shook the stone walls, forced its way into gaps he hadn't known existed, and drove snow like sand through an hourglass. The temperature plunged. 20 below. 30 below. 40 below. Daniel fed the fire constantly, dragging log after log from the stack he'd built against the inside wall. Scout pressed against his legs, shivering despite her thick fur. The cabin was holding, but just barely. Cold radiated from every surface, and the fire could only fight it to a stalemate. By midnight, he understood. This was the storm they'd warned him about, the once-in-a-decade killer that rolled down from Canada and erased whatever stood in its way. By dawn, opening the door revealed nothing. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Snow had buried everything. The woodpile outside was unreachable. The outhouse was gone, somewhere beneath 8 feet of white. The world had become a howling void, and his cabin was an island inside it. But the walls held. River stone locked tight, mortared solid. The wind screamed against them and found nothing to grab. Snow piled high and couldn't force its way in. The cold seeped from the stone, yes, but those same massive walls absorbed the fire's heat and released it slowly, steadily, keeping the interior livable while the outside tried to kill everything that breathed. Daniel rationed his firewood. He melted snow from drifts pressed against the windows. He shared his food with Scout, who had stopped shivering and now watched him with complete trust. "We're going to be okay," he told her. Her tail wagged. She believed him. The pounding came on the third day. At first Daniel thought he was imagining it. The storm still raged, visibility was still zero, and the idea that anyone could be outside his door seemed impossible. But Scout heard it too. She sprang up, barking, scratching at the door. Daniel took his rifle, not because he expected to use it, but because you don't open a door in a blizzard unprepared, and lifted the bar. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin, followed by 3 figures so coated in ice they barely looked human. "Please," one of them gasped. "Saw your smoke." Daniel grabbed the nearest body and dragged them inside. Scout clamped onto another coat and pulled with all 40 pounds of stubborn determination. The third stumbled through on their own, and Daniel slammed the door shut against the screaming white. They collapsed onto his floor, and only then did he recognize them. Harold Whitfield, 67 years old, the man who'd told stories about families dying on this very land. His face was pale with frostbite, his hand shaking so badly he couldn't undo his own coat. A woman Daniel didn't recognize stood behind him, about 30, with dark hair frozen into stiff icy ropes, clutching a bundle tight against her chest. The bundle moved. It made a small, thin sound. A baby. Wrapped in so many layers it was almost invisible, but alive. Beside her was a child, a boy maybe 6 or 7, conscious but barely, frost whitening his eyebrows and cheeks. The car went off the road, Harold managed through chattering teeth. 3 miles back. Tried to walk to town. Got turned around. Saw the smoke from your chimney. 3 miles in this storm, at 40 below. They should have been dead. No one survived 3 miles in a Montana blizzard. But they'd seen his smoke, the smoke from the chimney he'd built with stones he'd hauled from the river. In the cabin everyone said would kill him. "Get by the fire," Daniel said. "Now." The woman's name was Margaret Chen. She'd been driving from Missoula to visit family in Clearwater with her children when the storm caught them. The baby was 8 months old. Her name was Lily. The boy was 7. His name was Thomas. Harold had found them about an hour into their walk, having been out himself checking on a neighbor when the blizzard closed in. "The whole town's buried," Harold said later, after Daniel had wrapped him in blankets and forced hot coffee into his shaking hands. "Power's out. Roads are gone. Nobody's going anywhere until this breaks." "How long?" Daniel asked. The forecast said 4 days, maybe 5. But the radio died yesterday, so who knows? Daniel looked at his supplies. Enough for 1 person and a dog for 3 months. Enough for 5 people and a dog for far less. "We'll make it work," he said. Lily was too young to understand fear, only that she was warm now after being cold, and that made everything right. She slept against her mother's chest while Margaret wept silently, tears freezing before they could fall. Thomas didn't speak for the first 6 hours. He just stared at the fire with eyes that had seen too much. When he finally talked, his first words were, "Can I pet your dog?" Scout answered by climbing straight into his lap and refusing to move. "She likes you," Daniel said. Thomas wrapped his arms around her like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned liquid. Scout let him, her eyes meeting Daniel's with an expression that seemed to say, "This one needs me right now." That night, 5 people and a dog slept in a 12-by-6 stone cabin while the storm screamed outside. They slept in shifts, someone always awake to tend the fire. They slept in piles, sharing body heat, because the cold was too aggressive for anything else. Harold took the first watch. When Daniel woke to take the second, he found the old man crying silently, face turned toward the wall. "Mr. Whitfield." Harold wiped his eyes roughly. "I've lived here 43 years. I thought I knew these mountains. I thought I knew what survival looked like." He turned toward Daniel, his face raw in a way that didn't belong on a man that weathered. "I laughed at you when you first came here. I told everyone you'd be dead by Christmas. I said worse. I said the land would kill you like it killed the Garrett children 30 years ago." His voice broke. "And now here I am, Alive because a 17-year-old boy built a better cabin than any of us believed possible. Alive because you hauled rocks out of a frozen river until your hands bled. Alive because you didn't listen to a damn thing any of us said. Daniel didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. "Thank you," Harold whispered. "Thank you for being too stubborn to die." The storm broke on the 5th day. Daniel opened the door onto a world remade. Snow drifted 20 feet high in places, burying everything that wasn't strong enough to fight back. His cabin rose from the white like a ship in a frozen ocean, stone walls standing proud above the drifts, smoke still rising from the chimney that had guided 4 people to life. The rescue party arrived on day 6. Men on snowshoes, dragging sleds, following the smoke they could see from 3 miles away. They found the Chen family alive and warming, shaken but safe. They found Harold Whitfield with frostbitten fingers that would heal and a worldview that wouldn't. They found a 19-year-old boy and his dog calmly melting snow for coffee, as if surviving a historic blizzard while sheltering 4 unexpected guests was just another Tuesday. Frank Murdoch was with the rescue party. He stood in Daniel's doorway, staring at the stone walls, the efficient fireplace, and the neatly organized supplies that had kept 5 people alive when they should have died. "I owe you $50, he said. "What?" Daniel asked. "I bet you wouldn't last until November. Ray bet on December. Harold bet you'd die on this land like the Garrett kids." Frank shook his head slowly. "We were all wrong. We were so damn wrong." Daniel shrugged. "You didn't know me." Frank nodded, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "No, we didn't. But we'd like to, if you'll let us." After the blizzard, the town of Clearwater had exactly one opinion about Daniel Hartley. And that opinion had shifted completely. He was still the boy from Chicago, still the teenager who had bought impossible land and built a cabin alone. But those facts carried new meaning now. They meant determination. They meant resilience. They meant the kind of stubborn strength Montana respected above almost everything else. That spring, people came up the mountain not to watch him fail, but to learn. Harold brought his grandson to see the stonework, explaining the techniques Daniel had shown him during the 5 days they'd been trapped together. Margaret Chen returned once the roads cleared, her children in tow, arms full of food and gratitude. Thomas, the 7-year-old who hadn't spoken for 6 hours during the storm, now talked about Daniel endlessly, telling anyone who would listen about the boy who built a stone house with his own hands and saved their lives. Ray Bishop offered Daniel a job at the gas station. Frank Murdoch offered him a partnership in the hardware store. A rancher named Wilson offered him 40 more acres bordering his land, at a price that was clearly charity dressed up as business. Daniel turned them all down. "I appreciate it," he told them, "but I came here to build a life on my own terms. I'm not done building yet." That summer he added onto the cabin a second room, a proper porch, and a workshop where he could practice the masonry that had saved his life and the lives of 4 strangers. Scout patrolled the land like she owned it, growing fat on scraps from visitors who couldn't resist her knowing eyes. Harold Whitfield came by every few weeks, always with an excuse, a borrowed tool to return, a question about stone cutting, a message from town. But mostly he came to sit on Daniel's porch, watch the mountains, and talk about nothing at all. "I've been thinking," Harold said one autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the blizzard, "about what makes a person belong somewhere. I used to think it was time. How many years you'd lived in a place? How many generations has your family been there?" He sipped his coffee. "Now I think it's different. I think you belong when you've bled for the land. When you've built something that matters. When you've saved lives, or had your own saved." He looked at Daniel. "You belong here more than people whose grandparents are buried in the Clearwater Cemetery. You earned it stone by stone." Daniel didn't know what to say at first. Then he spoke quietly. "My grandmother left me the money to buy this land. I never met her. She gave me up when I was born, and she died before I aged out of foster care. But she left me enough to start over." He paused, watching Scout chase a squirrel that clearly wasn't afraid of her. I used to be angry about that. About all the years I spent getting passed around when she could have taken me in. But now I think maybe she knew something. Maybe she knew I needed to build my own home, not inherit one. Maybe the money was her way of saying, I can't give you a family, but I can give you a chance to make one. Harold was silent for a long moment. Did you? He finally asked. Make a family? Daniel thought of Margaret and her children, who wrote every month and visited every season. Thought of Thomas, now learning to lay stones under Daniel's patient guidance. Thought of Frank and Ray and the others who had gone from mockers to friends. Thought of Scout, who had found him when they both needed finding. I think I did, he said. Not the kind I expected, but the kind I needed. Harold nodded slowly. That's usually how it works. Daniel Hartley lived in his stone cabin for another 63 years. He added to it constantly. New rooms, new outbuildings, and eventually a second house for the woman he married in 1968 and the 3 children they raised together. The original cabin became a workshop, then a guest house, then a small historical curiosity visitors asked to photograph. Scout died in 1974 at the age of 13 and was buried on the hill overlooking the river where Daniel had once gathered stones. He cried at her grave, the first tears he'd shed since childhood, and he wasn't ashamed. He taught masonry to anyone who wanted to learn. Dozens of stone buildings scattered across Montana carried his influence. The way he once wished someone had done for him. Students who had once sat on his porch, listening to his quiet stories, learning that a life could be built from nothing if you were willing to haul rocks until your hands bled. Harold Whitfield died in 1979 at 84 years old. His daughter later said his last words were, "Tell the stone boy I'll save him a seat." Daniel never knew exactly what Harold meant by that, but he liked the sound of it, and he carried it with him. Daniel Hartley died in 2025 at 80 years old, in the same cabin he had built with his own hands 63 years earlier. His children and grandchildren were there, gathered close. His wife, gray-haired now but still sharp-eyed, held his hand. A dog lay at the foot of the bed, not Scout but descended from a dog who had once known her. Daniel's last words were simple. I was warm. The gravestone his family chose was made from river rock collected from the same stretch of water where a 17-year-old boy had once stood knee-deep in ice, gathering stones for an impossible dream. The epitaph read, Daniel Hartley, 1945 to 2025. He built his home. Then he built his family stone by stone. The cabin still stands. Its walls are as solid as the day they were finished. River rock fitted tight, mortar smoothed by hand, raised by a boy everyone said would fail. Visitors come sometimes, just to see where it happened. To stand in the doorway where 4 frozen strangers once stumbled in from certain death. To touch the stones that held back a historic blizzard and kept 5 people alive through sheer stubborn existence. And almost every time, someone asks the same question. How did a 17-year-old build something like this? The answer is always the same. 1 stone at a time. With hands that bled, healed, and bled again. With a dog who believed in him before anyone else did. And with an absolute refusal to let anyone else decide what he was capable of. That's how you build a home. That's how you build a life. Stone by stone until the walls hold, until the fire burns, until the smoke rises, and until someone lost in a storm sees it and knows, finally and impossibly, that they are going to survive. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in building life 1 stone at a time. More true survival stories, forgotten wisdom, and real human resilience are coming. Stay with us.